And that's why I really, think that Jim is really great, a visionary when he talks about how we can reform IMF, World Bank, and we have more emerging countries' participation there, which I think is really a very wise suggestion. But now, Jim, World Bank, and now we also have other development banks. We have AIB, Asian Infrastructure Bank, and we're New Development Bank. Can we have some kind of international bank board of some kind, or a consortia or alliance of kind? Can we combine B3W and BI, or maybe upgrade AIB to GIB, a Global Infrastructure Bank? So something in that direction, because I see how we can multilize this global initiative on infrastructure. Maybe it's time now, if this is the consensus of every major countries, why can't we work on this? Because now you see the WTO, actually, because of this virus, we are postponing the MC12 at the end of this month now. But infrastructure seems every country has the consensus. But how we tackle that? How we can really work with BI and B3W? Jim, your opinion, please.
I love the spirit of how your mind approaches this question. It's very consistent with the spirit of how my own mind is, especially since I led the AMR review. And that we need to have people open their minds to think a bit more, let's call it laterally, instead of in such a narrow, conventional way. Because otherwise, as the past 20 years or longer has shown, we cannot deal with the challenges that the world is faced with. And three specific quick things in this regard. First of all, I can't miss the opportunity in this regard, in the spirit of Leslie's comments about social infrastructure spending, but linking it to global health. One thing that all 5 BRICS countries share very clearly is the significant challenge with drug-resistant TB. And I have said for many, many years, an obvious, simple, clear area of genuine, fruitful policy cooperation for the BRICS countries is to try and finance new, effective vaccines or drugs to deal with TB. Because otherwise, the BRICS countries will not reach their potential. And that's just one simple example. But secondly, in the broader spirit, arguably, as both of you would know, the World Bank's investing arm, the IFC, already could be the basis for exactly such a more ambitious global entity. But the IFC and all these other ones need to think in a truly global public purpose sense. And the last thing to say, in the context of this, and I throw it back to the wonderful spirit of how your mind is approaching it, Henry, the idea of a global health and finance board should be seen really ultimately, sometime in another decade or longer, a global public goods board. In that we have a world in which economic policy is not just trying to deal with very narrowly measured outcomes that are defined by conventional macroeconomics. Because what we have found in our lifetime is they generate these enormous externalities. And they become so big that they threaten the very framework in which we all live on. And so you are exactly right about the kind of degree of open-mindedness and the degree of thinking of these things in a different framework than we have done for much of certainly of my professional lifetime.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I think you're right. China is actually one of the transformation. China was able to lift 800 million people out of poverty. I think this great infrastructure transformation is taking place in China. So now they want to, probably collaborate with the world on those infrastructure. That's where BI is really implemented for the last 8 years now. And as a matter of fact, we're just tomorrow, the China-Laos railway will be opened. We're connecting the ASEAN countries. So you see that kind of infrastructure activity will really be the drive and the peacemaker for the world. I agree. You said IFC and all the other international financial institutions can we really revigorate, revitalize those institutions with the AIB, with New Development Bank. So Leslie, what do you think about how we can get all the development bank work together, on BI and on many other initiatives?
And I think there's already very deep collaboration amongst the development banks. It's now deepening because of the climate change agenda. I mean, as you might know, recently at COP26, the multilateral banks issued a joint statement where essentially almost half of all of their future development assistance and exposures, lending, whether it be loans, guarantees, equity, will be towards climate finance. Most of the institutions had targets before of 25, 30, 40%. It is now progressively moving up. So that deep collaboration is already happening, but we haven't yet consolidated it as a system. We still function as individual institutions, and we can probably better act as a system if we act in a more complementary fashion. But I think what the climate change agenda has done is kind of be a catalyst for that greater collaboration. There's already discussion. For example, Kenneth Rogoff argued recently in a Project Syndicate article for the creation of a World Carbon Bank, because if each country put in place their own carbon policies, like the European Union just put in place a carbon board adjustment mechanism, set of proposals, we will have very inefficient outcomes. So I think some institutional reform might still be necessary, Henry, but what I can definitely indicate is that multilateral institutions have deepened their collaboration over the last couple of years, more so recently because of the collective agenda on climate change.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I want to come back to Jim for another question. When you served as a commercial secretary for the UK government, and all those international, the new trading schemes, RCEP will be effective January 1st. CPTPP is another emerging new global, at least for the Asia Pacific trading system. And UK is planning for join that. China is planning for join that. So what do you think of this kind of new, 21st century, new high standards trading system that can really revitalize the global system, including the WTO reform? How do you think those initiatives can happen? And also the relation between China and UK maybe can work on these new initiatives.
Thank you again, Henry. I mean, this is another question that could take more than an hour to answer, but I'll say two things, which are contradictory. First of all, and this is talking very much as an economist, quite often I think people over-exaggerate the importance of legal trade deals. If you look at patterns of global trade, or the best example I can ever give you is that at least until the past 2 years, Germany had started to export more to China than it did to its neighbor Italy, even though it was part of the same EU with a common free trade deal and the same monetary system. And it's because, of course, of the enormous rise in domestic demand in China and demand for the kind of goods that Germany is so powerful at. And the truth of the matter is global trade is really driven by relative rates of domestic demand. And as part of that, and linked to aspects of your previous question that I didn't have a chance to talk about, I would love to see within the BRICS and separately, China and India cooperating on some of these things a lot more. Because if you look at how they've emerged the past 20 years, and if you look at the world the next 20 years, if China and India get their own trade cooperation right, it would literally without any exaggeration, transform patterns of global trade. And that would be the basis of so many other positive things that would happen. The contradictory part is, of course, and that's my second point, is that we need to have more and more sophisticated trade agreements to deal with the rules in which we all engage with each other around the world. But it is not as important as making sure the countries that are behind those trade deals want to see the opportunities being equally shared between them around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I agree. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the BRIC countries should really have further collaboration. I mean, they are already, very, very important in the players. And I think that, particularly as you mentioned, China and India, I mean, being the two largest neighbors, I mean, have a similar 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And there are so many things. I've been to India a few times, and I saw so much potential for China to companies to work there. I mean, there's so much to invest and to collaborate. And of course, I think, if we can really get these two countries to collaborate, I mean, you're right. The global trade pattern could be changed as well. And because China has already become the second largest economy, and you projected India could someday take over Japan, the third largest economy. And, that could still happening. And I think there's all the reasons that we should collaborate for the BRICS countries. That's what the President Xi said, at the BRICS summit, the multilateralized, and we should support and collaborate and work together. I think we almost come to the end of a discussion. I know you've been quite busy, but we still have a 2 or 3 questions from the medias we collected, and my staff was showing me there was almost 100,000 people watching us online, and so this is a very important section. There's one question from a major Chinese news from China News Agency. It talks about the BRICS cooperation involves countries in South American, Europe, and Asia. What is the significance of cooperation between Europe and Asia, and cultural exchanges between East and West? And so what about BRICS countries and Western countries and US, EU, and all the others?
If I realised there was going to be 100,000 people here, Henry, I would have gone to the hairdressers and made myself look much better. But I'm very grateful. I have a simple part of answering that. I'm a very fortunate person that, at least until COVID and for much of the previous 30 years, travelled around the world frequently. And in my view, one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was the good fortune and the ability to be able to travel to countries in Africa, Latin America, of course, Europe, North America, and in particular to Asia. And you can only really think truly globally if you experience how people in local societies feel, because that only gives you a flavor of being able to understand the way people think and the cultural differences. And so, of course, and I would argue one of the great strengths of the BRICS group, which is often overlooked, the fact that it does include Brazil from Latin America, 2 countries from Asia, and Russia that's in the middle of them, itself is a source of great cultural and geopolitical strength. And so the more these cultural exchanges can take place, and the societal and economic things that can be thought of for shared benefit that go with it, as what I would sometimes lazily call, it would be a no-brainer. It's one of those free lunches in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe this question also, there was talk about some culture. You mentioned in your recent FT article, you talk about South Korea become really very successful, and also China, to that matter, as well. I mean, we have also Indonesia coming up very quickly. So do you think this kind of Asian culture, diligent, hardworking, central, government play a lot of role and the coordination, and so would that make a, BRICS country a little different? I mean, even given your number of BRICS countries, it seems the BRICS countries in Asia perform relatively well compared with other continents.
I mean, this is a fascinating issue, and I tried to. My original contribution to the FT was a longer length, where I actually tried to have a paragraph on this exact topic, because back in the 2003 BRICS paper, we studied 50 years earlier what would a similar analysis have suggested about 2003. And what is fascinating is that already a number of North Asian societies reached the potential such an analysis would show. Japan, Hong Kong, and of course, South Korea, which in my opinion is arguably the most interesting country in the world of more than 45 million people since I was starting professional life, because today it's the only one that has a GDP per capita as those of European G7 members. It is an astonishing achievement. And it is a shining example, as is much of North Asia, for so many other ambitious countries around the world, and frankly, including Leslie's own South Africa, which has a similar population to that of South Korea, how can you achieve this shared prosperity in order to deliver a better life? And there are great virtues about the interconnection between some greater involvement of government, enormous use of education and technology. And I think it's something that many North Asian countries share really powerful evidence of, which whether it be Latin America or many countries in Africa, need to understand what they can adopt for their own societies and implement.
Leslie, do you have any comment on those questions? And of course, New Development Bank is doing all those great things. And so what do you think of the BRICS? There's actually a question about the concept, and when you first proposed is included 5 rapidly developing emerging countries, but now we have Jim mentioned about South Korea and also Indonesia and many other, Mexico you mentioned. So what do you think about other countries that can bring you talk about quite a number of join your banks? What do you see the potential as a whole for those emerging economies?
Thanks, Henry. I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, I think one of the contributions that BRICS, and this is what Jim will always be credited for, and what the New Development have done, as I said, is to create a coordinated voice for emerging markets, because all the other banks, all of them, Asia Development Bank, European Investment Bank, IFC, EBRD, and so on, all of them have a control structure in terms of who has the most votes dominated by the developed world. The New Development Bank and BRICS is a unique construct also from a global governance perspective, in a sense that here you have 5 countries coming together, very different sizes of economies, and yet have an equal say. China's got a GDP of 15.6 trillion, for example. It is 31 times bigger than South Africa. But South Africa also contributed $2 billion in equity, and China has no bigger say. It has no veto power. If you look at the control structures in the world since after the Second World War, when the IMF was formed, the World Bank, and so on, obviously the US was the biggest economy way back at 50% in 1944. So they entrenched control structures for themselves. But today, you have the second largest economy sitting as an equal partner with a much smaller economy. So from a governance perspective, you also have a unique experiment, which one can see as reasonably successful. Clearly, what is required now is to take a fresh look at globalization for countries like South Africa, for countries like Brazil, to see how can we become the South Koreas in the next couple of decades to come. There was I would argue, and time is too short now to sort of make the case that there was a sort of favorable period of globalization, which I think enabled the rise and growth of Korea. Favorable factors also here in Asia, which encouraged and enabled the industrialization of Korea over the 1970s, 80s, 90s into what, as Jim has said, now in the top 10 GDP per capita. But there's a lot of lessons we could certainly learn from Korea as a shining example of a country that was transformed from, developing country GDP per capita in the 1960s. In fact, I think Korea had the same GDP per capita as Ghana, for example, today. And if you now look at the countries in economic size, it is just so different. So in short, I think that the world has changed quite fundamentally, and we need to derive lessons and extract what we can learn from those success stories to try and reproduce them.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you said something very significant. The world has changed profoundly, and I think the governance system of new developed banks, every country is relatively equal and have a really important role to play, and that really fits Jim's vision. That new emerging countries should be more into the globalization that after Bretton Woods system. We should really reform that and participate more so that we can really reduce our geopolitical tension. We have more economic say and economic benefits of that. So that's really the spirit I think Jim has already demonstrated 20 years ago, and you've been really practice that at the New Development Bank. And so that is really something we should really, other countries, particularly current developed world G7 and also international governance, we should think about, this kind of new governance style. I now have a final question actually from a Brazilian newspaper, also from the correspondent Marcelo Nino. He's the chief correspondent based here in China, and he heard about Jim will appear on my program, and he actually raised two questions from the O Global, which is a Brazilian major, one of the major Latin American correspondent in China. The first question is, comparing your expectation 20 years ago to the reality today, which of the BRICS countries disappoint you the most, and why do you think that had happened? First question. Second question, what should be the BRICS main focus today to help with a better global governance? So Jim, we will let you to answer this question raised to you.
Thank you. I know O Globo as a financial newspaper very well, and amongst the other great things about the BRICS acronym, it's allowed me to travel to that beautiful country, Brazil, many times. I'm going, in the spirit of trying to balance everything out, I'm going to contradict myself, but in a sense of humor. China has obviously been the most successful BRIC, but for me personally, in the spirit of what Brazil also represents, which is probably the greatest soccer football playing nation in the world, China is also the biggest disappointment because it never took ownership of my own obsession of Manchester United Football Club in England. And in the days of the great global, that brief period of the golden era between the UK and China, I had the privilege of being on that tour with President Xi. And his advisors allowed him to be succumb to going to visit Manchester City's ground and not Manchester United's ground. And I don't know how I failed in my ambition there. The second thing to say is of course, Brazil and Russia, as the journalist asking the question knows well, equally share the position of being the most disappointing. And in many ways, Brazil's is more than Russia's because Brazil has better demographics than Russia. But I quickly add one of the, again, as people at O Globo and many other Brazilian newspapers know, Brazil is often, in some ways, the most unpredictable of the BRICS. I will never forget when I was there in 2010, when Brazil was doing so well. Many people, including representatives from O Globo, would ask me whether they thought Brazil could grow as strongly as China in the next decade. Literally, seriously. And I had looked at them and said, you must be mad. But that year, of course, in 2009, they kind of had done nearly. And today, many people probably think Brazil can never grow ever again, which, of course, is equally ridiculous. So what I would say is, to finish for now, I think both Brazil, especially Brazil, certainly will not be anything like as disappointing as it's been the last decade. And maybe that's the case with both South Africa and Russia also. Hopefully. Yeah. Hopefully.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. And so actually today, we're coming to the close, and we have a very exciting discussion. You give us the history review and perspective of the BRICS countries, and also the role that the BRICS countries can play in the global governance system, global health system, global economic system, and also how China, you have been giving high credit for China development, and also other BRICS countries like South Korea. So I think we have touched on many subjects, and particularly how the developed world, Western countries can really work with China. I mean, you give a lot of good advice on that, and so really appreciate. So I want to conclude with maybe your concluding remarks, and we will start from Leslie. About our subject today, and other topics you want to finish with your concluding remark.
Thanks very much. Look, we are at a very interesting period, and it's an historic crossroads, really, where I think this whole drive towards the green transition will provide fresh impetus for institutions like ourselves. We are obviously hugely excited about becoming a much bigger, more emerging markets focused institution, becoming much bigger than what Jim dreamed of in 2001. Over the next 5-6 years, I would anticipate that this bank is likely to have, 25, 30, 40, 50 members, and become a bigger emerging markets bloc that will make a profound contribution to the world of multilateralism. And within a space of 5-6 years, this institution has already made its mark in terms of its contribution. I'm very excited, and I think I share this with my colleagues about what this new phase entails. Now, the global pandemic has kind of depressed sentiment very much, Henry, as you know, but I think it seems to us that if we integrate our approaches around health and integrate that into sustainable development, we might be able to conquer this global pandemic through more coordinated global multilateral efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Jim, and so we started with your Financial Times paper just 2 days ago. BRICS. How some of the disappointed you have. I mean, the editor gave you a very sensational title, but China probably is the least disappointing. China actually probably outperformed your expectations in terms of
it did.
Gold GDP development. So now we're having we're having a large audience from China today hear from you, and so what's your expectation for China, and how China can play a better role? I mean, you have always championed BRICS countries' role. For the global development and global governance in the future.
Thank you, Henry. And again, listen, thank you so much for including me. I just want to also say one thing that I think, to reiterate in my own mind, something that Leslie said early on in this discussion that's so important. Even though 20 years is a long time in my lifetime, in the history of man and women and life, it's not. And as Leslie said, the BRICS Development Bank has only been in existence for 6 years. So I look forward to the discussion the three of us have in another decade when it's 30 years and 16 years. Because, it's important to keep that in perspective. Because we live in an era where there is a lot of negative mood about so much. Second thing, and why I say it that way, is one thing I learned throughout my life at Goldman Sachs in particular is never let a crisis go to waste. Never. And the making of how most of us are as individuals, or any countries or any governments, is how you deal with a crisis. Crises will always happen. They are unavoidable because they are a consequence of human beings. And the key issue is we all need to respond to them properly. And again, Leslie's right about this one in COVID. This creates enormous opportunities for things to be thought about doing differently, including cooperation. And then thirdly, it leads me lastly to your specific point about China. I think as we can see, and here again, I hope I tread carefully in my words. I think we can see in recent years, China sometimes finds itself a little bit surprised about the scale of global focus on China. And of course, it's understandable because China's emergence has been so new. But as China gets more and more bigger, it has to find a better way of integrating its own thinking and what's right for its own citizens with the desires of the rest of the world. Every time I've ever, the 30 or 40 times I've been to China in my life, I'm always so remarkably impressed with the educational and technical abilities of so many people I meet. But I think in order for China to deal well with this next decade and beyond, it's got to find a slightly different way of positioning how it thinks and integrates with the rest of the world, which, by the way, is just as important for the rest of the world as it is for China's 1.3 billion people.
Yeah, that's really impressive, really great. Thank you, Jim. I think we are entering a very challenging time, and also challenging world that probably once in a century that we are experiencing this pandemic. As you said rightly, that we should not let crisis wasted. We should really giving a new birth and a new system and improvement of our current global governance system. And for the last 76 years of the Second World War, we had global governance, 0.10. 1.0, of course, global governance 1.0. Now we're getting the global governance 2.0. So I really thank you for your proposing the BRICS countries, proposing China, and give the credit of China performance. But I think the world should really work together and with the developing countries, with all the G20 countries, and I think that development banks actually has a very good example of how we can work together. So thank you for creating this concept 20 years ago, and now we have the chance to talk. And I hope that actually after another decade we can come talk again. So really appreciate your time, and thank you and Leslie for sharing your wisdom, and thank you so much, and also thank our audience tonight. Thank you. Okay.